Well, good afternoon, good evening, good night, or good morning, everyone, depending on when you're watching this and from where in the world. We are so thrilled that you're here with us again on Automation Hour. Before we dig into today's content, we will get started with some logistics. So Luke, if you want to hop on over, we do have all of the lines muted, but we love it when you interact with us. So please post your questions either in the questions widget here in GoToMeeting or also on the Trailblazer community in our Salesforce Automation Hour group. We are recording this and it will be available on our YouTube channel after the session is over. So again, connect with us where it makes the most sense, whether that's YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, or on the Trailblazer community. We absolutely love connecting with all of you. So it's been a great year. We've gone boot camp, and over the entire year, we've done a variety of things, helping you prepare for your automation design, teaching you how to build the different kinds of flows, and now we are working through best practices. We're going to wrap up the year with some migration strategies and some options for integrating with external systems. We might even dabble just a little bit in some Apex, kind of get going under the hood of what's here. So we invite you to continue joining us for the rest of this year. Of course, we cannot bring these to you without the help of our amazing sponsors, so we want to make sure we give them a great shout out. First of all, Concrete.io has been with us since the very beginning. Say thank you to them. If you haven't, please check them out. They've got some great offerings there. And of course, our other sponsor, ActiveCampaign, helps us send those emails out to you, reminding you that these webinars are happening. So if you need some email marketing solutions, definitely check them out as well. We thank them for their support. So your co-hosts, you have me today, Michelle Hansen, along with Rakesh Gupta, but we know that we are not the reason you are here. You are here for the content. So we are going to turn it over to today's guest presenter, who is a first-time Automation Hour presenter, Luke Freeland. Luke, welcome to Automation Hour.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Luke, and I'm a freelance technical architect. You can visit my blog at matillion.com. I'm also a Salesforce Ben dev courses creator, in case you want to learn how to do some Apex development and learn how to do triggers and things like that. I'm also a Rochester, New York dev group leader. Been doing that for 5 years. And if you like to follow me on social media, you can reach me on Twitter at Luke_Freeland. So let's jump in. So in this presentation, we're going to be covering flow best practices part 2. But before we jump into mine, I want to do a little quick recap on the flow best practices from the previous session, which was hosted by Monica Sandberg. So she covered, I'm just going to go over these really quickly because the recording has the details. She recommended, hey, document your flows. It's very helpful to outline the flow's purpose, and also ensure consistent naming across all the various elements, nodes, and variables within your flow. It definitely helps with understanding and a lot of other things. Another best practice is managing flow access. Build your bypasses into your flows. So she had shown, hey, you can use custom permissions and other kind of configuration data to put in a bypass so that if you need to basically turn everything off, you can very easily. And one common use case is, hey, I've got a bunch of data I need to get in the system. Maybe the data is not as clean as it should be, but it's got to get in there anyway. And I'll clean it up after it gets in. So you want to turn off all your automation, get it in, and then you can work with the data as needed. And then you also want to use permission sets to grant or restrict access. Another best practice, as a reminder, is you want to avoid hard coding record IDs. I think the example she had used is record type IDs, which is very common. And why that's dangerous is because if you create a new record type in a sandbox, for example, when you deploy that record type to another sandbox or eventually production, you're going to have different record type IDs until those sandboxes get refreshed from production. And during that time, the record type IDs will differ, which will cause issues. So typically you want to avoid hard coding record IDs whenever you can. to prevent that from happening and being an issue. Also, you want to use null and empty checks by using decision elements before you act on records. And so this is another way to prevent various errors from occurring. So for example, when you're, I wish Salesforce didn't do this, when you want to delete records and you have like a collection of records to delete, you want to make sure that you actually have something to delete before you call delete. Otherwise, you'll get an error. It'd be nice if Salesforce just did that check for you and just didn't delete anything, but it is what it is. And then she also mentioned doing some duplicate record checks. I think the example she said she had was, hey, if you've got some configuration records where there's the potential for having duplicates, you should make sure you have one and only one and the right one before using it. And I have a little link to the recording in the slide deck right here. And of course, it's already out there on YouTube if you need to view it. So now let's jump into some other best practices for flows. So one other best practice is using formulas in record-triggered flows' start criteria. The example I'm giving here is kind of piggybacking off of that record type example. I've seen in other resources that people are like, oh yeah, you shouldn't hard code your record type ID. So let me just put that in, custom label, custom setting, custom metadata record, somewhere stored in Salesforce, and then just use that and just manage that separately in each environment. Change the ID as needed. And I'm like, yeah, that's not really needed, because now that you can have formulas in the start criteria, you can simply just say record type developer name equals the name of that record type. And so that totally simplifies managing that. So let me go over here to Salesforce and just kind of show you an example of that a little bit more. So I've got an account object record triggered flow that I want to only work on partner accounts. So I've got a record type named partner, and whenever this account is created or whenever an account is updated, I want it to do some stuff. And so to do this, I went ahead and said formula evaluates to true. And I had to do a formula because record type is not available because it only gives you the fields directly on the object. And a record type is a parent object. So in order to traverse that relationship, you have to use the formula. And so by using the formula here, I can say record type dot. I like to use developer name instead of the name, because the developer name on the record type shouldn't change. That's kind of the equivalent of the field's API name. And so the record type's label might change, but the record type's developer name should not change. And so that's why I advocate developer name instead of the label. I just set it to partner here. And so that way I don't have to store record type IDs anywhere. It's pretty straightforward right here. And another thing that's great about formulas is that it is more capable than what you see just in here in the and conditions in terms of operators and things like that. So of course it clears it out. So the functions and the resources available to you are more rich, and you can develop more complex criteria than what's otherwise available just in the regular conditions list here. So I hope that makes
Luke,
sense.
while we're on this subject, we have a question.
Yes, please.
So a lot of times I've seen a formula field on the record with the record type name or record type ID in it so that you could just reference it as a field on the record. What are your thoughts about doing it that way?
That would
It's
be
a little bit of
acceptable
a
too.
question. So,
Yeah, I think it's kind of personal preference. You can absolutely do that way too, where you can just say record site name as like a custom formula field, um, and do it that way. I think it's a little redundant, but that works too. I don't think that's a bad way. I just think it takes up an extra field when you don't need to, unless you're using it in a lot of different places for some reason, and it's just a more convenient way of doing things. But that's my 2 cents.
so the other part of that, and it is kind of a trick question, if you're using a formula field, those are not available until you get to the after save context. So then you can't use that record type in your before save flow triggers.
Oh, good point to know. I always forget that little bit about the formulas and the after save. Um, Good to know. I guess you tricked me. Okay,
Well, I think it's
so
an interesting thing to bring up because it's a great way to do it until you run into the before save and then it's like, oh, yep, doesn't quite work there. So just
mm,
being aware of some of those is always helpful. Otherwise, great question, just not 100% usable.
okay. Another best practice is using subflows for repeated actions. Now, why do we care about this? Um, a lot of times you want to do the same action across flows. So a lot of people will just recreate the same thing across all their different flows. But that can be very problematic because if you have to make a change, now you have to make that same change across all the different flows where that's implemented, which can be very time consuming and problem and tedious. So that's the maintenance problem of it. And then another problem is, well, what if you forgot to update it in one or more of those flows where it's kind of copied? Now you've got differing behavior where at first glance it might be, hey, this is the same. When you really dig into the details, they may actually differ slightly and get slightly different automation, which is probably bad. So one way of to tackle this is to use a subflow. So a subflow is an auto-launched flow. I think subflow has always been what I've called it. I think they renamed it to an auto-launched flow a few years back. So whenever I say subflow, I mean auto-launched flow. Um, and a subflow for our developers in the room is basically a function that you can call. And so with a subflow, all of the other flows can invoke this auto launched or subflow and then pass whatever input it needs. And then it'll do all of that same automation. So whenever a change needs to be made to that action, you can go to your subflow, make your changes there, and all of the other flows that use it will automatically inherit whatever changes are made. One thing to note though is a subflow is only available in after save record triggered flows, screen flows, and subflows. They're not available in before save record triggered flows. So let me jump in over here to this example email, of course. So let me go into flows. And let's see here. And let me showcase this particular thing. So one common example I've seen is, let's say whenever you have a flow error, in one of your flows, you want to send a fault email. So, and we want to send that to a particular support email. So a lot of times I see a lot of people do this pattern where they've got their fault paths for doing the error handling, which is great, especially in after save flows. Then they'll get their support email, which is usually stored in custom metadata or some other configuration record somewhere. And then they'll build their fault email based on the fault error information and send that out. Well, that's great. And again, if you have to make one change because, hey, maybe we want to add another piece of error information, or let's include the user information, or you want to include some other change in that email. Now you got to do that same change to all the fault error handling logic across all your different flows. So the example I kind of wanted to showcase was, hey, you can build an auto launched flow. So if we go back to flows, you would do new flow, choose auto launched flow with a no trigger so that other flows can then use it as needed. You would hit create. And the general idea is, time's sake, we're not going to go into every little detail, but the idea is, okay, you can create one or more input variables as the information that can be sent to this auto launched flow, and then the flow can do something with it. So if I go back over here to my auto launched flow, I will show that, okay, this flow is taking two variables as input. We've got the fault message, which is a text variable, so that the message for the error can be passed into it. And then we're also accepting the name of the flow that had the error in it. And then from which, once we're past that information, we go and grab the support email that's stored somewhere. In this case, I'm using a support email custom metadata record whose developer name is support email. And then from that, I am going to build a flow error message email and send that out to the support email. And so the body is very simple. It just says flow error message using the vault message that was passed to this auto launch flow. We're using the email as the recipient address from the configuration record. And then for the subject, we're saying, hey, we had a flow error for flow using the name of the flow that was given to us. And so now, using this approach, whenever we have a fault in one of our flows, we can then invoke this flow, subflow, excuse me, and it'll send the flow error email as needed. And then if we ever have to make a change to our error handling logic, we can just do that right here. So for example, another idea could be, hey, in addition to sending the flow error email, maybe we want to post to Slack or Chatter, or kind of put it in some other communication channel that we've got an error email. Or maybe another idea is, hey, we want to do logging. Let's log that we've got an error email, and we can kind of capture all the different errors that are occurring in our system, and see which ones are the most frequent and need our attention the most. So those are just some different ideas to think about, and kind of the primary use case for using an auto-launched flow. So let me go back here. So yeah, using subflows for repeated actions. Any questions on that?
So what other use cases are there for using auto-launched or subflows? Like error handling is the example that always gets used, but have you done it for anything else?
Yeah, I was actually going to touch on that a little bit, but I'll just also say that another reason to use a subflow is to help with complexity or maintenance. So if you've got a really complex, after save flow or a screen flow or a scheduled flow, where we're talking, it's really complex. Meaning, in my mind, it's got 50 or more nodes or elements in it on the canvas. Then that's really complex. So if you want to break down that complexity so that your canvas is simpler, take one piece of automation that is kind of cohesive and kind of tied all together. You can take that and put it into a subflow, and then instead of having all your things regarding faults, you can just put that in a subflow. Or hey, here's my create chatter post regarding this particular thing. Obviously, there's a create chatter post, but maybe there's other stuff you got to do in addition to creating your chatter post as part of that cohesive action. You can also put that in a subflow, pass it the necessary information, and then it'll make your main flow simpler. And then, oh, hey, I don't really need to know all the details about this particular action. So you can just delegate that to your subflow. It'll be all encapsulated there. And that way your main flow becomes simpler. You can use one or more subflows as needed. And then later on, if you have to use that same particular action in a different flow, now it's available also as needed. So I also use it, back to your question, to basically manage complexity long term to make maintenance easier. Does that make sense?
Yep, sure does. Thank you.
All right. Another best practice I have is staying current on the latest flow capabilities. Salesforce has been enhancing flows in every release for years now. I mean, whenever I look at the release notes, I'm like, oh, I'm always excited to look at the flow section because there's just so much buzz and investment going on there. And I'm like, naturally, I come from a dev background, so I'm always thinking, hey, okay, I always got to use Apex, but wait, no, flows are usually my kind of go-to first uh, automation option now, because it's so capable, almost on par with Apex. So that's why I think, as a best practice, one should stay current on all the flow capabilities, because it seems like with every release, you could do something new that you couldn't with flows before. So I always recommend looking at the release notes, watching videos, viewing different resources, and not only just reading about them or watching them, but I also recommend experimenting with them. Obviously we all have day jobs, or we're pretty busy with a lot of stuff, but I think it's important to just try different things out so it becomes more concrete, and you can learn what the actual capabilities are and similarly what the limitations are. A lot of times Salesforce is like, hey, now you can do this great thing. But then, oh, well, yeah, if you do it in that very specific way, in that very specific use case, but if you try to do it slightly different, then it might not work. So there's, little nuances with that. So to kind of take that as another example, as a best practice of that, one awesome new capability that has come on the scene, which I believe is new in winter, um, is the ability to use flows for validation, record triggered flows, which is huge. I can't even say how awesome that is. Validation rules are great. I use those primarily as my first implementation option. But when I have to do anything more complex, typically I would have to use an Apex trigger, unfortunately, um, or some combination of other options. But now flows also support validation, record triggered flows. So for example, I should say that intermediate is, in my definition, validation logic that's more complex than what validation rules can support. And so in the primary use case I've always thought of was, validation rules can use fields that are directly on the record and parent related records and fields up to 5 levels, right? But validation rules do not support validation using child records. So what if, for example, I'm going to show it here in a second, you had some validation such that when a opportunity becomes closed won, and in your particular org, you have the requirement that that opportunity has to have at least one opportunity product or opportunity line, then if it doesn't, you want that opportunity to not be closed won unless there is at least one opportunity product. So with a validation rule, you can do that, but you'd have to use that with some other automation. So for example, you'd have to have some kind of roll up count on that. And so there are various ways of doing that, such as roll up helper. I don't think, I'm trying to remember if you can have a roll up summary. I always forget if opportunity products have to have as a master detail. But anyway, you could have like some kind of count on the opportunity and then a validation rule. But it's just a little bit more work to do that. Whereas if you use like an Apex trigger, you can just, when opportunity becomes closed won, you can just query to see if it has any opportunity products. And if not, then do the validation. So let me go ahead and open up this flow to kind of showcase how to do this in just one particular way. So I've got a opportunity record triggered flow here that is run on create or update. And it probably only needs to be really done on update. But I am using some entry criteria here to say, the stage is closed won. And if it's new, well, of course, that's not going to work, but it's really should just be changed, I think. And then we're using an after save, aka where the optimize of the flow for is actions and related records. And so with that, we are going to be running immediately. And then we have a get to fetch the opportunity products for this particular opportunity that's become closed won. We're going to grab all the records and we're going to automatically store all the fields. And just a little segue, as another best practice that just came to my mind. Whenever you're using a get, I think the default should always be automatically store all fields. And that's because the get will only query the fields from the database that are actually used within the flow. And so I think this is one of those little options that a lot of people don't know how it works, and then they'll like choose a different option where they are explicitly listing the fields to query. And then if you need another thing, then you have to go back into the flow and add it again. When you really don't have to do that. The default is just automatically store all the fields. That works in 99% of the cases. The only time that it'll really fetch all the fields on an object, which can be problematic, especially if you've got like hundreds of fields, is when like you're using get records and like a subflow, in which case it will query all the fields on the record. So that's just a little tip around that. So after you get your opportunity products, you use a decision to say, hey, is this null or not? And if not, sorry, I should have said only the first record, and I should have done a count on that. So we're assuming there's like only one record can be returned, and if it's null, then we have no opportunity products. And if we don't have any opportunity products, then we can use the error message here, which is a new element that is available in flows. It's got very similar options to a validation rule where you give it a name and then you can choose where to display the error. You can say, hey, I want this to be at the top of the page or on a specific field. And then of course you can give it an error message. And so this is text. You can pick some different resources here like you would, so you can incorporate dynamic information into your error message. But in my mind, in this example, we just have a simple error message saying, the close won opportunities need at least one opportunity product. So if I went and updated an opportunity that was closed won without any opportunity products, this error message here would show at the top of that opportunity. I guess depending on which, if you're using Classic or Lightning, the error messaging can vary on the location in terms of where it shows on the page, but it'll show on the page. So I think this is a great addition to flows. And I've been really excited about this. I've been wanting this for years and years.
The custom error message thing is super cool, and that is very new. Speaking of keeping up to date with the latest technologies, right? So Ron had chimed in and said, technically for opportunities, there's a hidden system field that we can use for this instead called has opportunity line items.
Okay.
Which I always forget about that field until I'm in Workbench doing something on opportunity and it slaps me in the face and I'm like, oh, hey, how are you doing? But I have 100% used this pattern with especially like custom child objects. So absolutely, if you need to figure out, do we have any child objects for this? I think there's a blog post on it that has some steps too, if you want to follow. We'll see if we can't dig that up. But this is absolutely a great step forward in validation logic because we couldn't do it with validation rules before, and you'd get stuck.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say I think it's great for intermediate logic, things that are, child records, things like that. If you have some really, really complex validation logic, I think I would probably defer to go using Apex instead, if that's within your skill set. Mostly because I think it'd be easier to manage long term, and the automated tests from Apex tests would be easier to test that as well. I think flow tests are okay, but not great. I think they're a little clunky in their current iteration, but maybe we can expand on that another session, but that's just kind of my 2 cents on that at this time. All right, so let's jump into the next best practice. You want to keep your complexity low. And in my mind, this is a guideline. So ideally, you'd want to keep your flows to 50 nodes or less. Meaning, if I go back here to Flow Builder, each one of these is a node. So your decision element, your get, basically anything that's on your canvas, I'd consider a node. So you want to keep your nodes, or excuse me, your flows as simple and as possible. One way of doing that is, as a reminder, you can use a auto-launched flow, also known as a subflow. So you can encapsulate all your logic, and then that'll just become one element instead of, say, 5 or 10. And I have this little illustration here, which is probably a little hard to see, but it's probably got, I don't know, hundreds of nodes on it. And trying to maintain that would be a nightmare. Like I wouldn't even know where to start. That just looks like a maintenance headache, to say the least. So the main reason I say this is because complexity is exponential. A lot of people think, oh, I'll just add a few more nodes and, it's just going to take a little bit more time. Well, yeah, that's kind of true when you only have like 2 and you go to 3. But as you go from like 10 to 20, 20 to 40, it's actually exponential in terms of how much time it's going to take to maintain and cost in the long term. And maintenance is the most costly phase of software development. And flows, believe it or not, in my opinion, are programming. It's just not using code. It's using a graphical programming language is how I think of flows. So being able to manage your complexity is very important. And so breaking them into smaller chunks with subflows is one way. You can split your flows into multiple flows also. So for example, if you've got, kind of the I wouldn't say old school, but like a different paradigm is, okay, let's have everything in one particular record triggered flow. And I think this is a consequence of, hey, process builders, you wanted to put all of your logic in one object process builder so you can manage the execution order. With flows, you can actually control the execution order. So I kind of prefer having multiple but smaller record triggered flows on an object rather than one big one that does everything, because the complexity is much smaller, in my opinion, and it's much more easy to reason about and how to do everything. And another way to kind of manage complexity is to use invocable Apex. I know that might be a scary word for some of you, but if you've got Apex in your skill set, I think Apex is a great way to do it, because Apex, the instructional density is much higher. That means, put differently, you can do more work in a few lines of Apex than you can with the similar amount of nodes in Flow, in my opinion. So you're able to capture and reduce that complexity because you can do more with fewer lines of code than you can with a flow. I hope that makes sense. And 50 is a guideline that I've come up with, and that might even be too high. I could see some people saying like maybe 20 or 25. But that's just kind of like a raw guideline to kind of put a number to it. Um, any questions on that?
Nope, I think we're doing good. Definitely appreciate you explaining what you mean by instructional density, though. I think even I, as a not real advanced developer, we'll call it, was like, instructional density? What are we talking about? So it's always good to learn kind of those practices too. And more people are considering flow to be just visual programming. So I think you're right. And it's important that we all keep in mind as we're building these flows. I mean, even if we're quote unquote just admins, which nobody's just an admin, let's be clear. It is Apex under the hood, and it's got to play nice with all the other Apex in the org, which can be a little tougher to do sometimes because we're not held to that same standard of test classes that you are when you write it in Apex itself.
Absolutely. All right. Now, I think this one's probably just a given, but just in case, another best practice is build and test in a sandbox first. Um, I still find a lot of people are just creating flows directly in production and then hoping for the best. And I mean, it is certainly an option, especially in my mind, if you have to do something very quickly and the org is burning down because you got some very big problem you got to deal with right now. But that should be the exception. Generally speaking, whenever you're building some new automation for whatever reason, this could be flows, code, or whatever else. You want to do that in a non-production environment, which is a sandbox typically. And so that reduces the risk of causing production issues uh, for a lot of reasons. You're doing that in an isolated environment. You can test that. If you screw something up, No big deal, typically. And you can go and fix it. And then once it's all good, then you can deploy it to production. One trade-off with this approach is it's slower at first because you have to build it over here in a sandbox, test it, and once it's all good, then you can deploy it downstream, eventually to production. But in the long term, I think this is actually faster because if you're doing stuff in production and break stuff, often this will cause data issues, which then have to be corrected. And, sometimes you'll send out unwanted emails and then, oh, hey, now I have to send out a corrective email to all of those recipients saying, hey, that was an error, please disregard. And, you know, so if you can avoid all of those headaches, which then have to be fixed in the first place by just following this best practice, then that actually makes the development a lot faster overall. And I hope that makes sense. Any questions on that?
Looks like we're still doing good for now.
Okay. Best practice is kind of piggybacking off of some other things. You definitely want to know Flow's capabilities and limitations. There is so much you can do with flows now that you almost think, hey, I can just do anything I need to with a flow, which for a lot of the common use cases, I would say is true. Um, but sometimes there are limitations with flows that just, isn't the right solution. So in my mind, for example, like if you're doing like a lot of integration work, where you're doing a lot of like call outs from Salesforce to another system, I think while it is possible now to use the new like Flow HTTP call out, um, that may or may not be the best option. I think Apex or maybe some kind of middleware would be a better option. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so it's kind of on a case by case basis. And then, of course, you always have to be wary of limitations. So, for example, like with a scheduled flow, everyone's like, oh, hey, it's scheduled, so it's got to be asynchronous and use the asynchronous limits, right? Nope, you're still bound to the synchronous limits. So, for example, in a scheduled flow, you only get 10 seconds to do all your work across all the different, Apex, whatever else that scheduled flow may use and do. Whereas if you're using, let's say, batch Apex, that's scheduled, that is going to adhere to the asynchronous limits. And, you get 60 seconds by default to do all the work. And you get more memory and things like that. So there's little, kind of caveats around the tool. You have to be wary of, okay, is this going to scale? And things like that. So that's why I think learning Flow's capabilities as well as its limitations is another best practice. And depending on what your use case is, kind of dictates, okay, flows are great, or maybe another option is a better solution. But by default, I think flows are probably the go-to first option to consider for a lot of stuff. Because I think most automation, especially I think record triggered flows, are doing same record field updates as like 70 or 80% of all common automation. And so flows, especially before save flows, are the de facto kind of go-to for that. Any questions around that?
Not yet. I can tell you that I did see once upon a time, I thought I had it. Flow was going to be great. And then the one thing I ran into is there was an object in the database that Flow actually can't trigger off of. So I wanted to be able to share a document whenever it got attached to a record automatically. And would you know that content documents and content document links were not available to invoke a flow from? So I actually had to have a friend help me write a trigger that did nothing more than get a little bit of data from the record that got created and pass it into a flow so flow could do the heavy lifting. But 100%, it was one of those, should probably know the capabilities and limitations there because you're going to run into them at some point.
Absolutely. That's a great use
So,
case.
yep. So Georgie also chimed in and asked, is there a document somewhere that has a good list of common flow limitations?
That is a great question. There are Salesforce has documentation on like the Salesforce flow limits. Um, hey, how much memory you can use, how much time you can use, how many. There used to be a limit of like, hey, you can only run 2,000 elements in a given flow interview. They removed that, which is nice because you used to only be able to do so much work, but now you can do a lot more work. And then, you're pretty much subject just to the CPU timeout limit. But more generally speaking to like, hey, different use cases and things like that, I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to search for that. Michelle, do you know of one?
I don't. I was actually remembering there was a conversation on Ohana Slack not too long ago that someone said, it was asking, is there a list of all of the objects that you can't trigger flows from? I don't know that I ever saw an answer to that question though, to be able to post that. But if I happen to find it, I will absolutely throw that in the chat.
Right. Another best practice is you want to leverage pre-built flows. There's a term in software development called not invented here syndrome, which basically means, hey, if it wasn't built here, then I'm not going to use it. So put differently, I'm always going to build everything myself. I'm not going to leverage, pre-built solutions made by some other person or another organization or the community. Um, so that mindset is very prevalent a lot of places. And so I think a best practice, not only just for flows, but just in general, is hey, is there a pre-built solution out there that I can use that'll help me solve my problem? So just start with the question, has someone already built the solution? And if you think to yourself, hey, this is probably a common problem, there's probably a common solution. So, search using your favorite search engine and see what you come up with. Um, you'd be surprised. A lot of people have built a lot of solutions that are available for free or low cost that will save you tons of time in the long run and get you up and running very quickly. So, a couple of resources that I particularly look at all the time are Unofficial SF. And so this is a website, unofficialsf.com, that contains many, many different flow components that are available through different flow managed packages that you can install into your org and then become available within the flow builder. And so there are many, many, many uh, different ones here. So I think this is very popular in the Salesforce community. So if this is your first time coming here and seeing this, I definitely recommend coming in here and checking it out. I wouldn't be surprised if you guys have already had like a session on it. Unofficial SF is just very popular and it's free, and it's open source and community managed. So I think it's a great resource for, hey, let me see if this has got a solution to one of those common problems I can't do with one of the out of the box flow builder options. Well, maybe this has a solution for you. And then similarly, a lot of people are familiar with the App Exchange, but there's actually a Flow App Exchange as well. I think is less well known, but there are lots of other Flow solutions on the Flow App Exchange as well, provided by different vendors for a variety of different things as well. So take a look at this and see what's out there. All right. So next, we have use the right automation tool. I think this kind of piggybacks off of some of the other things, but flows aren't always the best automation solution. And so, for example, you a lot of people will use flows for creating roll-up summaries for lookup roll-ups. But there are other pre-built solutions, such as the declarative lookup rollup summary, which, in case you are not familiar with it, is a community built and managed free open source managed package that you can install in your org. And then you can configure it to say, hey, I want to do these aggregate operations on these child records, such as like sum and count and first particular field, or there's lots of different aggregate operations you can specify, and then store it on the parent record. So effectively, it allows you to have a roll-up summary using lookups, but it also supports master details too. And the aggregate operations you can use are more, there's more of them than just the regular roll-up summary options of like count and sum and it's min and max. Don't quote me on that, it's been a little while. But there's more than you can do with just those operations. So that's one example. Another is, for very complex record triggered automation, I think Apex is probably a better solution for some of the reasons that were previously mentioned. So while flows are great, I don't think they're always the best automation solution. So in general, use the right tool for the right job. And lastly, I have kind of an oldie but a goodie. You want to save early and you want to save often. Flow Builder doesn't have autosave whenever you make a change. You want to make sure you hit that save button pretty regularly so you don't lose your work. So save, save, save. And I feel like that's probably just a given, just being when you kind of dig into flows and you're really working with it often, but I think it's just worth repeating. And that concludes my presentation. Does anyone have any other questions?
I have to laugh at this last best practice because this is one that's still 10 years later, every once in a while it comes up and bites me, especially because normally you've got multiple tabs open, you're doing multiple things and you'll be working on it and not realize that session settings have logged you out of the org on some other tab. And I'm working away and I go to do something and it's like, reload the page. I'm like, no, Flo, don't reload the page. And I'm like, save it. And it's like, but you want me to reload the page, right? And so I have even recently lost quite a bit of work on a flow simply because I forgot to save early, save often, and save again. So there is a lesson to be learned for all of us in there, I think. So I'm going to do a quick refresh and see if we've got any coming through on our Trailblazer community group, but I think you've done a great job of answering the questions that have come in through our chat widget. So Luke, if someone wants some more information on best practices, where do you usually go for that?
Typically, first and foremost, I like to go to Salesforce's documentation. So for example, I like going to architect.salesforce.com. And so, for example, there's a record triggered automation article that I like to go through because it kind of talks about, since record triggered automation is like literally the most common type of automation, in my opinion. And Salesforce had some stats like a few years back where they said like, roughly 70 to 80% of the automations that happen in a given month are record triggered automation, and especially like same record triggered automation. So that's, I think, my go-to first option for kind of best practices is just to go right from the source, Salesforce. So I like to use like architect.salesforce.com, developer.salesforce.com, their blogs. Of course, they've got different videos from different channels. Um, of course, there are other community um, resources out there too, such as Automation Hour here, Apex Hours, Coding with the Force is another one I like. Some of that is kind of more developer and code focused, but there's significant overlap between these resources, right? Uh, so I'm sure there's others. Stack Exchange, a lot of things are like, hey, what's the best practice around this? And so the Salesforce.stack Exchange is a great community that's focused just on Salesforce. There's a lot of great content in there. What else? Just of course, different forums. Salesforce has got forums, the different community groups or whatever they're called these days, Trailhead, Blazer groups. I forget what they're called nowadays. It's been a little while. Um, your local user groups is another great resource in terms of getting together with other people and just asking them in like an in-person session. I really like getting together with other like-minded folks and just talking shop about it, Salesforce in particular. And that way, of course, there's various Salesforce Slack and Discord um, chat spaces out there. I'm a big fan of the Salesforce Ohana Slack. Um, I'm on there. I've been on there since like 2017. We've got over, I think there's close to 12 or 13,000 members now. And, a lot of just great folks will ask a question and then, we'll just crowdsource it and do the best we can to answer those questions as well. So there's lots of different great resources out there to kind of learn best practices and just get information in general. I hope that helps.
Absolutely. So Sharon posted a question that I absolutely love. Um, Once you delete a flow, is there a way to recover it?
That I think depends. Um, if you have multiple versions, you delete one specific version, then you probably will still have other versions. If you deleted all the versions and that flow itself, then it depends. Meaning, okay, if you deleted it in production, well, and if you follow best practices where, okay, you develop your flow first in a sandbox, then most likely it'll still exist in that sandbox or other sandboxes too. Um, Another caveat is if you have some kind of like backup solution, meaning you got your metadata stored elsewhere, some people use a third-party backup solution, such as like Home Backup or Otisava or others. Of course, you can have your own like homegrown backup tooling too. Then you probably have that somewhere else, and so you can recover it from that other backup solution, such as Home Backup or something like that. Or if you have stuff stored in source control. So for example, hey, I've got some automation that periodically, let's say every day, grabs all the metadata from my org and puts it into like GitHub or Bitbucket or some other source control system, and then you can retrieve it from there as well. But if you are just developing in production, you don't have any archiving, you don't have any sandboxes, and literally your only source for that flow was the org itself, you might be out of luck. You could always try contacting Salesforce to be like, hey, can you recover this deleted flow for me? Your mileage may vary though.
Yep. Unfortunately, it's one of those things where deleting deleting anything in metadata besides field seems to not really have a recycle bin like data does. I know we've had Jamie chime in that Eclipse, which was an IDE back in the day, there was a way to go through the metadata and check a setting that could somehow pull it back, but we're not sure that that still exists. So I am a huge proponent of save a copy, don't delete a copy. Maybe delete it officially 6 months or 12 months later, just in case you need it back. But I have pack rat tendencies, so I don't know how good that is for
Yeah,
for
typically,
development.
yeah, just real quick, if you really need to develop or delete something, I would say deactivate it, wait a good period of time, make sure everything's running as expected, and then, delete it later.
Absolutely. Well, fantastic, y'all. I know we are at a little past the hour, so Luke, thank you so much for joining today and going through all these great best practices with us. Thanks everyone for joining and participating, and we will see you all in 1 week for our next automation hour. So hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everyone.